The fat apothecary's son she called a monster until he saved her life, and she realized. "Get back in your cellar, monster, before you poison the daylight," Arabella Sinclair said, the bell above Thornwood's apothecary still jangling from her entrance. Spring rain beat a silver rhythm along Broughton Street in Savannah, 1879, while inside the shop glass vials chimed faintly and camphor breathed through the air. Elias Thornwood, broad as the oak counter, apron freckled with tincture stains, spectacles thick as river glass, lifted his head from a mortar, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. Outside, a judge's carriage splashed past, the world of marble porches and iron balconies clipping by on bright wheels. Inside, a single sentence had cleaved a man's life to the quick. He could name every herb that calmed a fever, but there was no medicine for disdain. Behind him, the trap-door to the basement lab stood ajar, a mouth to the underworld where Savannah sent its unwanted genius. Lightning stitched the sky. Elias folded his hands, bowed, and answered with a voice as careful as a dose. "How may I help you, miss?" They say no gentleman in Savannah dared touch the apothecary's son, unless they wished their reputation to sicken and die. Arabella Sinclair had been taught that beauty was a duty and mercy a weakness. Judge Reginald Sinclair's townhouse on Oglethorpe Avenue gleamed like a verdict. Marble steps, wrought iron lace, mirrors tall enough to shame a saint. From childhood, Arabella learned to move like a metronome of propriety. Gloves pristine, voice cool, laugh rationed to the exact measure society approved. Her red hair and sea-glass eyes were spoken of the way men spoke of properties and bloodlines. She was expected to marry a planter's son with acreage measured in horizons and patience measured in inches. But perfection is a corset that tightens with every breath. Behind Arabella's polished veneer lived a loneliness she refused to name and headaches so vicious they made light a blade. On bad days, she would shut herself in a darkened room and count her inhalations until the pain retreated. On worse days, she went out anyway, afraid that absence would be read as weakness. In that world, softness was a fault to be starved. The day she called Elias a monster, the rain hadn't just soaked the streets. It had soaked her pride. A reception the night before had left whispers buzzing in her ears, too sharp, too sure she'd never hear them. "Pretty as a painting," one matron purred, "and just as shallow." Another voice, "A face for a pedestal, not a partner." She had smiled, teeth set, and gone home with a headache that throbbed like a warning bell. By morning, her mother's pain had returned, and Arabella was dispatched to the apothecary for a draught, an errand she resented precisely because it was ordinary. Elias's face had become the target nearest to hand. After she flung her coin and her insult, she stepped back into the rain, the bell clattering behind her like a rebuke. Wind clawed her parasol inside out. A wheel on a passing dray splashed her hem with gutter water. Her kid gloves, once pearl pale, streaked to the color of old bruises. Gaslight wavered in the storm and, for an instant, went out. Without warning, a wave of pain speared her skull so cleanly she had to brace herself against the pharmacy's brick. The door opened, spilling a modest triangle of lamplight onto the sidewalk. A large figure filled the frame. No lecture, no triumph, only a thick glass bottle held forward and a quiet sentence. "For the light, miss. It dims more kindly than a street lamp." Her kerchief slipped from numb fingers. He stooped to pick it up, his hand broad as a beam, yet when he set the linen in her palm, his touch was light as breath. She didn't thank him. Pride wouldn't let her. But later, when the pain eased and the lamps came back alive, she remembered the steadiness of that hand more clearly than her own cruelty. Elias Thornwood was a man built of contradictions, immense in body, but infinitely careful in motion. He lived above the apothecary's cellar, like a shadow of his father's legacy. By day, he served customers with the precision of a clockmaker. By night, he retreated below the floorboards, where shelves of amber bottles gleamed like constellations under candlelight. That basement was his sanctuary, the only place in Savannah that did not flinch when he entered. From childhood, Elias had been told that he was too much, too wide for the pews at church, too clumsy for polite company, too different to fit the Thornwood name. His father, a man of science and reputation, tolerated him as one tolerates a necessary embarrassment. "You have a fine mind," Dr. Thornwood would say without looking up from his microscope, "but God gave it to the wrong vessel." So Elias learned early that brilliance meant little if it was housed in the wrong skin. He buried himself in work, studying not the polished cures of European textbooks, but the wild plants that grew stubbornly in southern soil, pitcher plants, sassafras, feverfew, bloodroot. He found beauty in the things most men overlooked, much like he wished someone might one day find it in him. When he wasn't brewing medicines, he wrote small, clumsy poems in the margins of his notebooks, odes to moss, to moonlight, to hands he imagined would never touch his own. He had stopped believing in kindness long ago. Savannah's laughter had taught him that hope could be a cruel experiment. And yet, when the red-haired woman with eyes like firestorms had stood in his shop and called him a monster, something in him had cracked, not in anger, but in recognition. She had spoken the word he already used for himself. And then she had left, and he had watched her through the rain, her parasol folding against the wind. He'd almost turned away when she staggered. The moment she pressed a trembling hand to her temple, the part of him that was physician, not patient, acted without thought. He fetched the small bottle of diluted laudanum, stepped into the storm, and offered it with no trace of pride. When she refused to look at him, he said nothing. When she left, he only whispered to himself, "Let her forget my face, but not the pain." Later that night, he returned to his basement and opened his journal. Beneath a sketch of a white poppy, he wrote one line, "Even those who curse us may one day need our mercy." He didn't know that within 2 weeks, her life and his would prove the truth of it. The sickness struck Savannah like a whispered curse. First the judge's wife, then his daughter, fever, rash, the slow bloom of crimson sores that no doctor could name. Within days, the Grand Sinclair townhouse stank of vinegar and fear. The city's finest physicians came and left, shaking their heads. By the second week, even the nurses refused to enter the room. Elias heard of it from the butcher's boy delivering meat down the lane. He didn't stir at first. He'd been insulted enough to know when he was not wanted. But that night, as thunder rolled and the apothecary's lamp guttered low, a knock came at his door. It was Martha, the Sinclair family's old housekeeper, drenched to the bone. She fell to her knees on the wet step. "Mr. Thornwood," she sobbed, "the young miss, she's dying. Please, sir, they say you know herbs no one else does." Elias stood motionless for a long moment. He thought of the rain in her hair, of the word monster echoing like a heartbeat in his skull. Then he sighed. picked up his satchel, and said quietly, "Take me to her." The Sinclair mansion opened its doors to him the way a wound opens to a blade. Servants stared as he climbed the stairs, boots leaving wet prints on the marble. In the master bedroom, Arabella lay as pale as wax, her breath shallow, her beauty ruined by illness. Even the light seemed to hesitate before touching her. Tamphon Sinclair looked up, hollow-eyed. "Do whatever you must," he said hoarsely. "God forgive me if I've waited too long." Elias worked like a man possessed. He tested, smelled, tasted the residue on her sheets, the rash, the convulsions, the strange odor of spoiled almonds. It spoke to him in the secret language of toxins. "Nam Jock," he muttered under his breath, then caught himself, translating softly. "Fungal poisoning, rare, possibly from contaminated food." "There is no cure?" the judge asked. "Not yet," Elias replied. "But there will be." He built a laboratory in the Sinclair cellar, burning through candles and hours alike. He brewed decoctions of milk thistle, powdered willow bark, tinctures of wormwood, combinations untested by any apothecary alive. On the second night, his hand shook so violently he shattered a vial. Blood mixed with tincture on the table. He didn't notice. Upstairs, Arabella drifted between worlds. In fevered half-consciousness, she would see him beside her bed, his massive frame bent low, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness, murmuring calculations she couldn't understand. Once, when her throat burned too badly to speak, he held a wet cloth to her lips and whispered, "You are stronger than they think." 3 nights passed. The house had fallen silent except for the ticking of the hall clock and the faint clink of glass from below. Then, just before dawn, Elias climbed the stairs carrying a vial that caught the first light like trapped sunrise. "It's untested," he told the judge, "but if we do nothing, she will not last the morning." The old man bowed his head. "Then give her your miracle." Elias fed her the antidote by spoon, one trembling drop at a time. The hours crawled. He sat at her side, fingers pressed to her wrist, counting each faint beat until the rhythm began, faltering at first, then stronger, steadier. When her lashes fluttered open, the world seemed to exhale. "Ah," she breathed, voice barely audible. "You saved me." He smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that softened the heaviness of his face. "Rest now, Miss Sinclair. Science has done its part. Let nature do the rest." For the next fortnight he came daily. Arabella, weak but lucid, watched him move about the room, silent, deliberate, gentle in ways she hadn't thought possible. The same hand she once imagined clumsy handled her medicines as if they were crystal. When she apologized through tears for the cruelty of her words, he only shook his head. "Pain changes nothing I owe the living," he said simply. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the shutters, she asked, "Do you ever wish you were someone else?" He paused. "Once," he admitted, "but if I were, perhaps I wouldn't have been here when you needed me." It was a sentence that settled in her heart like a seed. And as the days passed, she found herself waiting for his footsteps on the stairs, for the quiet comfort of his voice. Each visit stitched something back together inside her that illness alone had not broken. When she could finally walk again, she asked to see his laboratory. The room smelled of mint and metal, every surface crowded with flasks, notebooks, and pressed flowers. "This," she whispered, "isn't a dungeon. It's a cathedral." Elias looked at her in surprise. "A cathedral?" "Yes," she said softly, tracing a hand along the bottles, "where faith is measured not in prayers, but in mercy." That was their silent bond, the unspoken understanding between two people who had both been judged and remade by pain. And one evening, as the lamps burned low, Arabella realized she no longer saw the man before her as monstrous. His face, once strange, now seemed familiar as sunlight. His size no longer loomed, it sheltered. The heart she'd once sealed behind vanity stirred, fragile and new. Savannah's whispers spread faster than fever. Word traveled that the judge's daughter had been saved not by God or medicine, but by the fat apothecary's son in the basement. At first, the gossip sounded like admiration. Then the admiration soured. People do not forgive miracles performed by those they once mocked. Elias felt it in the stares when he walked through the marketplace, in the murmurs that followed his back. The quack who fancies the judge's daughter. Perhaps he brewed the sickness himself just to play hero. And in the fine drawing rooms of Oglethorpe Avenue, mothers whispered that Arabella Sinclair had gone mad, in love with her own savior. It was only half rumor. For the first time in her life, Arabella no longer cared for the opinions of others. She began to visit the apothecary openly, bringing baskets of bread and flowers, staying for hours in the warm clutter of his laboratory. Elias tried to protest. "You shouldn't be seen here," he warned. "The city has a cruel memory." She smiled, fearless. "Let them talk. They only ever talk, Elias. You, at least, do." Their closeness grew, tender and unguarded. But Savannah society is an old beast, rich, proud, and easily provoked. One afternoon, her father called her into his study. The judge's face was carved in iron. "Arabella," he said, "this friendship, whatever it is, ends tonight. You will thank Mr. Thornwood for his service and keep your distance. A Sinclair does not marry beneath her station." Arabella's voice trembled, but did not break. "Father, he's not beneath me. He's beyond anything I've ever known." "Then you shame this family?" he thundered. "No," she said, standing tall. "I honor it, for once." The argument echoed through the house, ending in slammed doors and silence. That night, beneath the flicker of gas lamps, Arabella walked to the apothecary alone. She found Elias at his bench, the scent of lavender and smoke curling around him. "I've told my father," she said quietly. He froze. "And?" "He forbade me to see you." Elias turned away. "Then you must obey him. He is your world. I am—" "You are my world now," she said, stepping closer. "The only one that feels real." Before he could speak, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, uncertain, but it shattered years of silence between them. His hands hovered, afraid to touch, until she whispered, "Please." That night, the city's ugliest rumor became truth, and its most beautiful secret. But peace never lasts where envy lingers. Bradford Wellington, the judge's favored suitor and the man Arabella had once been promised to, returned from Charleston to find her name on every tongue. His pride and his fortune could not endure the humiliation. "She's bewitched by that beast," he sneered, "and I'll prove it." Days later, officers appeared at the apothecary's door with a warrant. Elias was accused of poisoning the Sinclairs, of creating the disease himself to win their gratitude and their daughter. The evidence was planted, a crate of fungus samples hidden behind his work table, a sworn statement by a chemist who claimed Elias had purchased toxins. He was dragged from his shop in chains. When Arabella heard, she fainted. By nightfall, she was in the courthouse, demanding to see him. Through the bars of his cell, Elias managed a weary smile. "Don't cry," he said softly. "Perhaps this is how the city pays its debts." "I will prove them wrong," she vowed. "Every one of them." He shook his head. "You can't fight men like Wellington. Their poison runs deeper than mine ever could." Her hands gripped the iron bars. "Then watch me." In the weeks that followed, Arabella did what no woman of her station had ever done. She investigated. She bribed servants, tracked shipments, questioned tradesmen. With Martha's help, she found the delivery boy who had brought the basket of mushrooms that started it all. Under tears and coin, he confessed. Bradford Wellington had sent it. Armed with that truth, she burst into the courtroom on the morning of Elias's trial. The gallery buzzed with laughter when she strode in, dressed in black silk, eyes blazing. The judge's gavel struck once, twice. "Miss Sinclair, this is not your place," her father warned. "It is," she said firmly, "because this man is being condemned for a crime committed by the one who calls himself a gentleman." She presented the basket, the confession, the chemist's letter of payment. Gasps swept the room. Bradford leapt up, shouting that she was lying, but Arabella's voice cut through like a bell. "You said once that Elias was a monster. Then let us see which of you wears the face of one now." The jury didn't need an hour. The charges collapsed. Elias was free. When the verdict was read, he didn't look at his accusers. He looked only at her, standing proud, trembling, radiant in defiance, and realized that courage could be contagious. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd parted around them, he took her hand for the first time in daylight. "They'll never forgive us," he said quietly. She smiled. "Then let them choke on their forgiveness." When dawn came to Savannah the next day, the city woke to a strange quiet, as if even the gossip had grown tired of its own voice. The scandal that had burned through parlors and newspapers for weeks ended in a single truth too luminous to ignore. The monster had been innocent, and the gentleman had been the poison all along. Outside Thornwood's apothecary, children placed wildflowers on the doorstep, tokens from mothers whose sons Elias had once healed without payment. Strangers nodded to him in the street now, awkward but sincere, as if finally seeing the man who had lived among them all along. But Elias cared little for the city's repentance. His eyes were fixed only on the woman waiting at the counter, her copper hair catching the morning light. Arabella had insisted on helping him reopen the shop, arranging jars and polishing glass as though she had always belonged there. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, watching her tie an apron over her silk dress. "This place smells of camphor and scandal, not exactly a lady's perfume." She smiled, a smile that reached her eyes now, free from vanity. "It smells like honesty," she said. "I prefer that." In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt their lives from the wreckage. Elias returned to his work, creating medicines for fever and infection, while Arabella assisted him, learning the names of every root and resin. The townsfolk soon began calling her the Apothecary's Angel, a title she accepted with laughter and a faint blush. One afternoon, when the air smelled of rain and crushed mint, Tamphon Sinclair himself entered the shop. His face, once carved from pride, had softened into something almost human. "Elias," he said, removing his hat, "I came to thank you, not only for saving my family, but for teaching me that judgment is a poor substitute for wisdom." Elias inclined his head. "Sir, your daughter taught me the same." The old man turned to Arabella. "You've made your choice, haven't you?" "Yes, Father," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I've never been more certain of anything." He hesitated, then nodded. "Then you have my blessing. Not because you need it, but because I was wrong not to offer it sooner." When he left, Arabella turned to Elias with tears in her eyes. "He's finally seen what I see." "And what's that?" Elias asked softly. She stepped closer, placing a hand over his heart. "A soul beautiful enough to make the world ashamed for not seeing it sooner." They were married that autumn in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. The pews were filled not with Savannah's nobility, but with shopkeepers, sailors, and the poor Elias had treated without charge. As she walked down the aisle, Arabella wore no jewels, only a single white rose tucked in her hair. When they stood before the altar, she took his trembling hands and said, "Elias, once I called you a monster. Now I know you were the only man in Savannah who was truly human." He smiled through tears. "And you," he said, "are the miracle I never dared to believe my science could find." When their vows were sealed, the church erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the raw joy of people who had witnessed redemption. Afterward, they walked home beneath the Spanish moss, the sunset painting the streets in gold. Children followed them, scattering petals, laughing. In the months that came, they built the Thornwood Institute, a place where anyone, rich or poor, could learn the art of healing. Arabella managed the accounts and correspondence. Elias led the research. Together, they worked side by side, two halves of a single mercy. And when night fell, the apothecary lights glowed soft and steady in the heart of Savannah, a reminder that love, like medicine, works best when given without condition. Years later, the people of Savannah spoke the names Elias and Arabella Thornwood with reverence, not as gossip, but as gratitude. Their apothecary had become something greater than a shop. It was a sanctuary where the sick found healing and the lost found kindness. Above the door hung a simple sign carved by Elias himself. "No one is beyond cure, not of the body nor of the heart." They built their legacy not with marble or fortune, but with time, with every hand Elias clasped, every letter Arabella wrote, every child they taught to mix herbs and read Latin names as though they were lullabies. In the early years of their marriage, society had tried to erase them. Invitations stopped coming, and the Sinclairs' old friends turned their backs. But the ones who mattered stayed, the dock workers, the freedmen, the orphans whose fevers Elias had broken with his trembling hands. Those were their congregation now, and slowly even the old families of Savannah came to knock again, humbler this time, carrying illness instead of pride. Arabella changed too, though not in the way gossip had predicted. The sharpness that once defined her beauty softened into warmth. She laughed easily, worked tirelessly, and spoke often of second chances. When she visited the schools Elias had helped fund, she told the children, "Once I thought kindness made you weak. Then I met a man who was kind enough to forgive me, and I learned it makes you strong." Elias never sought recognition. When newspapers tried to interview him about his medicinal discoveries, he deflected the praise. "My wife taught me everything I needed to know about humanity," he'd say. "The rest was chemistry." As the years passed, his father grew frail. Dr. Thornwood, once proud and distant, spent his final days watching his son in quiet awe. One evening, Elias sat by his bedside. The old man took his hand and whispered, "I was wrong, my boy. You were never a disappointment, only a better man than I knew how to be." When Dr. Thornwood died, Elias buried him under a willow near the Apothecary garden, the scent of rosemary and myrrh rising through the air. Arabella stood beside him, her hand steady in his. "He sees you now," she said softly. "They all do." He smiled faintly. It took the world long enough. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Some hearts are slow medicine. They need time to heal. And that was the lesson they left behind, that love is not blind, but patient, that mercy is not weakness, but wisdom, that sometimes the cure for cruelty is simply the courage to forgive it. Autumn drifted gently through savannah, turning the magnolias pale and quiet. In the thornwood garden, beneath branches heavy with the scent of herbs and memory, Elias and Arabella sat side by side on a wooden bench he had built decades ago. The air shimmered with the hum of cicadas. The last light of the evening lingered like a secret. Elias's once dark hair had turned the color of silver ash, his hands roughened by years of labor, but still impossibly gentle. Arabella, her fiery hair now touched with gold, leaned against his shoulder, reading one of his old notebooks aloud. Pages filled with sketches of flowers and poems scrawled in the margins. "You never told me you wrote this," she said, her voice soft as the twilight. He smiled. "You never asked." She read the final line, tracing the faded ink with her finger. "Perhaps monsters are only those whom no one stayed long enough to understand." Her eyes filled with tears. "Elias, you were never a monster." He turned to her, his voice low and steady. "No, but I was waiting for someone to teach me that." They sat in silence for a long while, the sky dimming to indigo. From beyond the garden walls came the sound of laughter. Young apprentices from the Thornwood Institute walking home, carrying on the work they'd begun. The world had changed around them, and somehow it had grown kinder. Arabella reached for his hand. "Do you ever think about how it began?" "Every day," he said with a chuckle. "A bottle of laudanum, a storm, and a spoiled girl who mistook pain for power." She laughed, brushing a tear from her cheek. "And a man who mistook shame for solitude." He squeezed her hand. "We were both wrong, and that's what saved us." When the first stars appeared, he leaned back, closing his eyes. "The city sleeps easier now," he murmured. "Perhaps it's finally learned what beauty really means." Arabella watched the starlight flicker over his face, the man she had once hated, now the only one she could not imagine living without. "You taught them," she whispered. "You taught me." He smiled faintly. Then it was worth being misunderstood. The wind rustled through the herbs, carrying their fragrance into the night. Rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, myrrh for love that heals. And as the crickets sang their quiet hymn, the story of the monster and the princess faded into legend, not of tragedy, but of transformation. If you've stayed with them this far, if you still believe that hearts can change and that love can rewrite even the cruelest story, then tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And whom have you learned to see differently since hearing their tale?